Thank you very much, Gillian. I suddenly thought you might have got a copy of my speech.
No, paragraph in.
Took my first paragraph out of my speech. Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. And I also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their elders past and present. And I thank the Affinity Intercultural Foundation for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry I'm going to mention this, and you weren't excluded because the room was a bit small, but thank you for the lunch, small lunch, the big lunch for the small group of people beforehand, so thank you very much, and I acknowledge the Affinity board members here today. In the abstract of this lecture, which I mentioned, Will You Still Need Me, and which you said he penned in 1966 when he was 24, and the oldest of the baby boomers were about 20. And I, despite the fact he was contemplating turning 64, I don't think many of the baby boomers thought they were going to turn 64, and they were being, I suppose, immersed in a youth culture of the 60s. Well, that was an interesting time, really. Chris, you remember that? And I was just... Well, I didn't take LSD and pot. Maybe some people who don't remember it, but I do remember it. I was busy trying to study as a mature age student. But they were exposed to, we were exposed to cultural references at the time expressing the exact opposite. Famous lines, forever young, and I hope I die before I get old. I wonder if the person who wrote that song is... they were saturating our radios. That's all we had really much. We didn't watch as much television. But, you know, the demographic clock stops for nobody, and it's ticking away there all the time. And but I became interested in this area when I was teaching health science students. And I taught for 11 years, physiotherapist, speech therapist, like Cumberland College here, before it joined Sydney University. Lincoln Institute was in Melbourne. And they were doing lots of child development, which I was teaching because I'd majored in child development. And they were doing quite a lot of paediatrics. And I said to the clinicians, why aren't they doing gerontology? Why aren't they learning about the world older person to set higher boundaries for their rehabilitation? If you set it here, they'll get to here. If you set it there, they may get to here. Well, they do geriatrics, was the sort of response I got. And I said, that's about the sick older person. And as our families get smaller and people get exposed to fewer older aunts and uncles, they have fewer experiences of successful people who are ageing successfully. And they were quite grumpy with me. So I started introducing life cycle developmental psychology into the courses and a diploma of gerontology. There was one here, just started a year before us in Sydney, and two of my colleagues and I started one in Melbourne. I had to go to America to actually get the relevant journal articles because there was one professor, believe this, in 1980 or 78, 80, there was one professor of geriatric medicine in the whole of Australia, and no people were studying gerontology. So it was really, you know, people, well, you know, they're going to die anyway. They're dead by the time they're 70, 75. And so, and you know, as long as we can get a spoon to their mouth when I had a stroke at 50, that's fine. So it was a very negative attitude about ageing, about rehabilitation. And so I decided to insert these courses into this. And so that's where it started, this passion for issues affecting older people. And it went into Parliament. I had 2 private members' bills to get rid of the compulsory retirement age over 2 parliaments. Chris, you know how successful private members' bills are, about 13 that have ever gone through. And they got rejected by the then government. And I pushed and pushed for it to be in our policy when I was a senator in the Liberal Party. And it got into our policy, and over time we got rid of the compulsory retirement age in the public service, a real boon for women to be able to go back and contribute to superannuation. And we got rid of the compulsory retirement age, and I think Christopher was involved with this with Michael Bohm. Every time one of the statutory authorities came up, we moved a motion to get rid, because it didn't have financial implications, to get rid of the 65-year-old retirement age. You couldn't retire from the army or be chief of the Defence Forces and serve on the War Memorial Board after 65. I mean, what a nonsense that was. Or the art gallery, or the museum, or any other statutory authority. So we gradually chewed away at that discrimination. But let's go back and let's look at the baby boomers now, age 60, those who are aged 65 and over, the first clump of them. They make up about 15% of the Australian population, and 2015, the Intergenerational Report projected the number of boomers to enter this age range will be more than double by 2055. Now, as a result of the high levels of post-war immigration, almost 40% of all migrants from non-English speaking countries are aged 50 years and over. Now, with rising life expectancies, the Australian baby boomers can now expect to live well into their 80s and beyond. I touched the first person I met who was 90. I was 25. I remember who it was. I remember where I was, because he'd been at the opening of the Harbour Bridge, and I thought, oh, that's a link, to that history. It was so rare to meet somebody who was 90. It isn't rare now. People, they say, she's 80, isn't she marvellous? They don't say that anymore. You've been 90 before you're marvellous. So that's been this huge change. So on average, we live about 25 years longer than our parents and grandparents. And I'm the oldest woman in my family other than my great aunt. I've lived longer than any of my female relatives on my mother's side and on my father's side as well. So you don't have those models that you think about it because you didn't see some of your relatives who are older. And these added years of life come with many opportunities, but they also come with challenges. I'd like to talk about two key areas of age discrimination and how they impact on older Australians, including those from core backgrounds, and what we can do to address it. The first one is workforce participation. And last year, the Australian Human Rights Commission conducted a national inquiry into employment discrimination against older people and people with a disability, and the inquiry was called Willing to Work. And through the voices of those who participated in the Willing to Work inquiry, the Commission consistently heard that older workers are subject to ageism, negative assumptions, myths and pervasive stereotypes which are associated with their age. They are seen as overqualified, won't fit the organisational culture, or not to be taken seriously as they're just looking for a path to retirement. I've got an absolute hatred of reports that somebody's initiated to kick the can down the road and they don't get implemented. And I've told both the Attorney General and the Shadow Attorney General that I am determined that as many of the recommendations of Willing to Work get implemented, as is Susan Ryan. And you think Susan Ryan's a force to be reckoned with? When we join forces, we're like a hurricane or a tsunami. And so she and I are committed to driving this Willing to Work report as far as we can. I was speaking to the Social Sciences Academy in November, and I thought, well, I'm one of them. I can actually have a bit of a go at them, us. And I had somebody apply for a job recently, and I read 3 of their articles. And I'm a trained psychologist and a researcher. And I said to this person, just tell me, in simple terms, what those 3 papers tell me as a person interested in policy. Well, he couldn't do it. He couldn't put that into simple terminology. And I wished I'd seen him before I spoke at this thing, because I said, it's all very well to write these academic papers, and you all get promoted, and they all get read, and you get promoted, and none of it actually has an outcome or an action. You're wasting your time. 1954, the Hutchison Report, which is a survey of Victorian older people. 1954, some of you here weren't born, some of you were. Guess what it said? They wanted to be seen as contributors. They didn't want to be seen as a burden. And they said, if we're well, they used the term, we're willing to work. And what has happened since 1954? So, we can't leave those reports lying fallow. They need to be tilled and watered and promoted, because we can't afford not to have our older population working. Now, a prevalence study of age discrimination by the Commission, I think it was done in 2013, found that over a quarter, 27% of people over the age of 50 reported having recently experienced employment-related age discrimination. Whether it's subtle or overt, the cumulative nature of age discrimination can have devastating effects on individuals. It impacts on their physical health, their mental health, their dignity, their intelligence, their self-esteem, and also whether they'll actually even keep applying for jobs. Older people from core backgrounds also suffered the double whammy of having a name that's different. And we all know that 2 CVs one with a European name and one with an Indian or a Sri Lankan name, are treated differently even though it's the same content. So you're getting the two things interacting. Almost 20% of the 1.34 million of all Australians aged 50 years and over were born in non-English speaking countries. And in 2015 there were over 140,000 job seekers from core backgrounds registered with Job Active, the Australian Government Employment Service. Of these, approximately a third were over 50 years of age. The inquiry heard that such factors as a strange surname, heavy accent, qualifications that are not recognised in Australia, and the fact that a person is nearing a retirement age could all contribute to a person's negative treatment in employment contexts. There are a number of examples they gave of people who said, I couldn't get a job when they looked at my CV when I came, because I had an accent, even though I spoke perfect English, they said I wasn't appropriate for the job. And older people from core backgrounds can also be more vulnerable to workplace discrimination because they're not aware of their rights under Australian laws. They may be reluctant to talk about workplace bullying or harassment or seek compensation for harm. They may also not be aware of the services and complaint mechanisms available to them. The complaints at the Human Rights Commission, the age discrimination complaints, discrimination that older people feel they've suffered, are the lowest of all the complaints. So one of the problems is it's very hard to actually identify whether you weren't capable of the job or competent, or you didn't interview well, or whether you're age. So it's very hard to actually pick that unless somebody said we don't have Indians here. It's very different from something like, well, you're not quite the right person for the job. So it's not as distinctive. You can't actually put your finger right on it. But we have had some wins when people have said, look, I think that person needed some counselling and needs to be treated differently. And some of the conciliation, we don't deal with them. We've got a separate part of the commission that deals with complaints. But it is interesting that age discrimination is one of the lower, in fact always lower in terms of number of complaints. As Australian population continues to age, soon there'll be fewer people of traditional working age compared with the very young and elderly. And therefore it's an imperative that we encourage older people to continue in the workforce, and also because they're going to live longer and they need more assets and more retirement savings. Older workers are also good for business. They offer a loyalty, low absenteeism, skills and experience. The Grattan Institute, in a recent report, estimated that a 7% increase, it's not very much, a 7% increase in mature age labour workforce would raise the GDP in 2022 by approximately 25 million. There have been a couple of other assessments that are around 30 million, 33 billion, I mean. That'd pay back some of the debt. Now, what can we do about the terrible waste of skills and opportunity? The Willing to Work report makes a number of recommendations to government, business and employers about things they could do to combat age discrimination. I'm currently working with government and employers to progress the implementation of these recommendations. I feel very strongly that the Australian Public Service and the state governments and territory governments ought to set an example. You can't ask business to do what the public service doesn't do and won't do. And so they need to be in on it as well. And some of the departments have now got age inclusion as one of their goals in their anti-discrimination in employment. Human Services is one of them. There's also a critical need to educate HR recruiters and managers. There was a recent, some of you know change.org, where people can set up a campaign, and a woman called Charmaine, why did I make that mistake? I was on television with her, and the presenter, I think it had been out at a party the night before, one of the presenters, she called her Champagne, and now I get it mixed up in my head every time. Charmaine had stopped work to care for her mother. She went to try and get work and couldn't get work, had a degree, a lot of work experience, was happy to do anything. She was happy to drive a school bus, would do anything. So she started this blog, and I was on television, and they showed a clip from her, and they said, is Charmaine unique? And I said, no, she's not. There are a lot of people in that situation. And then we were going to be on TV again a couple of weeks later, and I thought, I need to make Charmaine a friend of mine rather than an enemy. So I went through, at that stage, the 4,500 responses she'd had in her campaign. Some of them, I'm in the same boat. Others said, you know, I've tried. But if you went through and looked at them systematically, the most common comment was that the HR person was ageist. And I'm not going to be critical of young people. I had a friend to dinner once. She was doing a PhD at the same time as me, and a bit miserable, because you get a bit miserable when you're doing them. It's very lonely. And she said, I said, what are you doing for your birthday? She said, oh, nothing. I said, well, come and have dinner. And I'm cooking dinner thinking, 32, that's really old. I was 26. Fancy being 32. It just seemed really ancient to me. And when you're 26, 32 is very old. When you're 46, 52 is not very old. That gap changes. And so by what I'm going to say, it's not being criticising young people. It's because they're not exposed to as many older people to show them examples of successful ageing. And I think we need some deep changes in HR and recruiting. And I've already been working with the Australian Human Resources Institute to look at how we can actually drive some courses into the undergraduate programs to actually get that deep change. Just recently somebody came to me from the Port Phillip Council where they're doing some shared housing program, and she said, I've got a greeting for you. I said, oh, that's lovely, you know, you don't get many bouquets in some jobs. And she said, 3 of your students that took the first diploma of gerontology that you were involved in are working in the area with me, and they said they're still flying the flag to promote issues affecting older people. And I thought, that's the deep change we need. That's the sort of change. A campaign with an older person getting a job on the TV hits one cohort. But if you get some of those deep changes through education, you'll get longer term effects. So that's what I'm hoping to do. Then to modify those examples and put them in a form that's right for continuing professional development for HR people. And then I've been working with the Institute of Company Directors. By chance last night, they had the new incoming Chief Executive CEO of the Institute of Company Directors. So I thought, aha, well, I've got you beside me for a dinner. Because I think directors should be asking questions. They should be actually promoting diversity in their business, and diversity including ages, employing older people in their business. So it's right through from business down, from HR professionals and students. So they're the sort of things that I'm working on. So it's important to ensure that information and that this gets out to people about the benefits of employing older people. Now I know Bunnings has had a lot of positive things said about them, but they have been so innovative and so flexible. They have a thing called travelling team members. They call their staff team members. And so if you want to get out of Melbourne, which is why I applied for this job, because it's been 13 degrees down there for the last 2 weeks. If you want to get out of Melbourne, you can say to your boss, I'd like to go to Darwin and work for the winter. And they'll try and organise for you to work in the Bunnings factory in Darwin, and you come back to your job in Melbourne. But they designed this, and then somebody said, well, why can't young people do it? I want to surf up in the North Coast, but not when those octopus are around, and I'll come back to Lakes Entrance. And so they've got these people moving all around the place. Centrelink could do it, Coles could do it, Woolies could do it, the banks could do it. And the other thing they do is, I discovered this last night, Bunnings have a work agreement, an individual work agreement with every employee every year. And what does that mean? Well, I want to have my same income, but I'm happy to work an extra shift a week so I can have more holidays. So I want to work X number of hours and I want to do it over this pattern. Or I want to go overseas for 3 months. And so I get a deal for that year to work a different number of hours. Or I say, I want to have the same working hours as I had last year. But I can up the hours I work. Now, some businesses don't lend themselves to that, but Bunnings is open Saturday and Sunday, so they can do it. And what they talk about is they increase their flexibility to allow people to do it. you've got a sick mum living in Marimbula and you work in Sydney. How much nicer to be able to work down on the south coast, Bunnings, and get your mother sorted and help when she's ill and then come back. I just think flexibility is one of the things we have to think about, and that's what older people are prepared to do. I went to a factory in the United States. I was on a holiday, and I went to a factory in Michigan where they just trying to think. It was Michigan. It was Michigan. I was trying to think it was Michigan or Vancouver. It was Michigan, and they started. Two Italians started a company a business growing pears, and then it got bigger and they started distributing pears by mail. It's now a huge business where they do hampers and things. They have a whole workforce of older people who come in about 6 weeks before Thanksgiving and leave just after Christmas, and they work their tails off. The oldest one there was 82. They'd just had an 84-year-old retire, and he'd been doing this for 15 years, coming in Christmas, working fairly big shifts that they could, and they manage their shifts to meet. They have short changeovers so that they're not in the same job, that sitting down sometimes for 2 hours and standing up. And they've got this army of people who come in their mobile homes and park around the factory, and they've used that workforce. And they said we have the oldest part-time workforce ever, and they find that really very valuable. So I think there are some really exciting innovations that we can see here and overseas. And it's absolutely vital for the well-being of older people and ensuring that they have more assets. And I think just teaching some of the HR people that sometimes they think, what's their motive? Why would they want to work for less than they were earning before? Because they want to cover their costs and not eat into their capital. But they don't quite get that either. So they're the sorts of things we need to be educating about. The other topic there are 3 areas that I'm really focusing on: that willing to work and its recommendations. The other one is older women at risk of homelessness who have had a failed marriage or haven't had the opportunity to be in the workforce because they've been in and out of the workforce. And I'll just give you one example. I was on the plane the other day and one of the crew said to me, "Oh, what are you doing on the plane again?" And I said, "Oh, well, I've gone back to full-time work." She said, "Oh," and she looked at me as if, and I said, "It's a good thing, you know." And she said, "What are you doing?" And I told her. She said, "Let me tell you my story. My husband went bankrupt in the financial crisis. He started drinking and he beat me up and I left." And she said, "I'm 57. I've got $50,000 in super. And you know Munch's scream? I reckon he should have done one terrified." She put a face taut and she said, "I am terrified. If I had $50,000 to my name and I was 57 and no roof over my head, I would be terrified." And there's a tsunami of them. Across coal communities, most probably more hidden in the coal community because there's a culture that you get looked after when you're older. And that's the group I feel I need to focus on. It's a tsunami. The oldest of them is 70. I have a friend, a Sri Lankan friend, a double certificate nurse from a hospital in Britain, who's had 2 failed marriages. She had children late. They've had children late, so they've got all their children. The 2 children have got kids under 10. They can't look after her. The day she can't pay her $450 a week rent, this is in Melbourne, that's the day she'll be homeless. And there are people on the brink. My local council did a research program over 4 years of women who are renting a lower income, living on their own, and they interviewed them and they said, "What's going to happen?" And you know what they said? Almost to a person, "Oh, something will happen." It's almost too terrifying to actually address. And we're not got time to build the stock for them. We have to find other solutions. So I'm looking for an army of people to get behind them. One of my staff not one of my staff, but one of them who's interested in the area, and the commission said to me, "We should start a thing, Bricks for Chicks." And I said, "Yeah, that's a good title." Anyway, elder abuse is the 3rd thing. So it's willing to work, homeless women at risk of homelessness, and elder abuse. And this is often hidden and underreported, and there's a lack of current data about this. We think it's somewhere between 2 and 10%, but I think it could be much larger. The government is actually funding a prevalence study. They've done a scoping study. They've now issued a tender, and I think that will be signed off soon, to look at Prevalence. If anybody's got any ideas from your experience and background, I've argued that the hardest groups to get to are going to be rural and remote people, Indigenous communities and the core community. The more prepared the people who get the tender and the more information they get, the better will be the outcome. I think whatever we get, it will be underreported. Now, e.g., I went to see maybe I didn't know when before I went what was happening in their board. Went to see the CPA, the professional accountants. And somebody said to me, why are you going to see them? I said, they deal with a lot of old people. You know, I was thinking about powers of attorney. He said, we see the abuse in country areas. And he said, this is not people who are on a pension, this is people who are getting income from a farm. And we say, how come you've got 150,000 less than what you had last year? And they say, oh, my son took it. He'd broken marriage and he wanted to buy another house in Benalla or whatever else. And so I hadn't thought about accountants being a source of detecting financial abuse. So if any of you come up with an idea and think this is the way we could get at that information, then please send me an email and I'll pass it on, because we've got to think about every single way where people interact with older people, where they could actually say, of my 400 customers, I believe a certain number of them are abused. Let me give you an example. The social work department at St V's Hospital in Victoria decided that they needed to do something, and one of the social workers did a PhD, she's just handed it in. They trained from the senior staff down, right down to the junior staff, to report to the social work department if they thought the person was being abused. E.g., gee, I hope my son doesn't come back. And I use that because it's mostly sons, but some daughters, nieces, nephews. He's driving me insane. He thinks I should move into a nursing home. I'm going to be okay when I get out of here, but he's treating me like I'm a stupid old fool and wants to sell the house. That would be the sort of signal. So the thing, it was none of my business. I'm here to give her drugs or whatever else. They go to the social work department. Of the 400 people, I think she had 350 in her sample, but the 400 by now, they've identified 70% of them were in fact having powers of attorney being abused. So it was 70%. They were pretty accurate in detecting it. And now they've got a health justice partnership with the Seniors' Rights Victoria, and they now have a lawyer from Seniors' Rights in there up to 3 days a week, working with older people, saying you can revoke your power of attorney, you can make a power of attorney, you can put restrictions on your power of attorney, you can actually, and telling them what their rights are. A lot of them are called people from around that area. And so that's been the hospital was very reluctant to have them because they thought it was about litigation. And when they convinced them, no, we're not interested in whether their hips worked or not, we're interested in whether they're being abused. And now that's being copied in 5 hospitals around Victoria. So there are some really interesting, encouraging things that are being, creative things that are being done. But the most common form of abuse is financial abuse, and women are more likely to be victims than men. And it's particularly complex in the core community because a lot of them don't know their rights, their language barriers, they're socially isolated and they're increasingly dependent. And there are a lot of examples that I've been given, and one of them in particular, one of the things that I found most interesting is a community legal centre in Victoria, in Box Hill, that have been very creative. They've got an elder abuse network, 100 people, aged care assessment teams, core community leaders, pharmacists, doctors, police, and they did a submission to the Law Reform Commission. 45 or 50 of that 100 got together and had a workshop for a day. They then drafted a submission, and then another group, some of them the same and some who couldn't come the first time. So it was a real army of people. And they said things like, to me, when I met with them, the aged care assessment team aren't able to say, I'm entitled to have 15 minutes with this person on their own. So they go into a home to assess someone, and sometimes the perpetrator's there. And they say, we should have 15 minutes, and they can say, I don't want to go to a nursing home. I'm doing quite well, as I thank you very much. Or I want to go to a different nursing home. So this group asked me to come and meet a subset of their group, Chinese community leaders, the Indian community leaders, and the Greek community leaders. And they said to me, we've got an issue because our communities are being maligned because of the behaviour of some of the younger people in our community. They're bringing their parents out on a contributory visa. They don't know what their rights are, and they strip them of their assets. So I've been to see the Minister for Immigration, and I'll go back again to say that there's another called the CLC that's done some really interesting work on materials, and this is what bugs me a bit. This work, the person who's doing it has gone on to another CLC, but they've produced a really tremendous set of materials for older called community in the peak languages where the abuse is more common. And I think, well, that should be available to them at the post in China from where they're coming, or from India. So they get to know what are their rights, what in their own language, what can they do. Some examples. Well, my children wouldn't be like that. Well, sadly they are sometimes and often. And I think that we've been looking at some overseas countries where the actual contribution that they make is bonded, is held in a bond for them and released at a certain amount each week, so that children can't get it and take it. So are there things that can be done? You ought to be thinking, those of you in the call community, if you've got evidence that that's happening, tell me what I should suggest to the Immigration Minister, or tell me what I should suggest to try and reduce that happening. How do we let people know? But what upsets me is there's all that material there. It could be so easily distributed across Australia without people using the same energy to replicate it. So I hope that we can actually have some sort of clearinghouse for information that people can say, well, we'll order 5,000 of those because we could use them in Western Australia or New South Wales. One of the recommendations from the Elder Abuse Report was we have a national plan, and and that's been agreed to. Most probably, some of you will be part of making a contribution to that national plan. So the report does deal with a range of issues that affect called communities, older people in called communities. Powers of attorney is one of the major issues. The banks have called for a registration of power of attorneys because people come in and say, I've got my mother's power of attorney, and they take money out of the bank. And somebody else comes in and says, I've got a more up-to-date power of attorney. The banks don't know. And it seems a very easy recommendation to have a registration of power of attorney. But when you actually get down to implementing it, it's challenging. Because where do you put it in? If you make it too hard, does it reduce the chance of somebody making a power of attorney? I won't ask you now, but usually if I ask an audience to put their hands up, about 10% of people say they've got an active power of attorney. You should have one. I don't care how old or young people are, you should have one. And you should have been educated by the person that assisted you in writing that power of attorney, that you can put clauses in it. I've got one that says that 2 of my friends who are GPs have to say that I am not of sound, I've lost mental capacity before it's released from the solicitor. You can put all sorts of things in it, but people don't get taught that. People don't think they've given it away and they can't get it back. So we've got a big learning, and I'm about to see the Law Council and the Law Society about their role, in the way they prepare. Some of you will have had powers of attorney done and they whip you in there and whip you out and don't tell you all the things, and I'd like to see an interactive computer program where people can go in and it says, do you realise this is what a powers of attorney do? Do you realise, da-da-da-da-da? If you chose one person, who would you choose? And it would populate a draft. Now you can have a second power of attorney. And this is the advantage of having one and not having 2. So it would educate people. So I've been talking to the E-Safety Commissioner about, because I've just been given $50 million, which I would have liked to have my hands on, to look at reducing elder abuse online and scamming. So there's some of the messages, but please, if you have an idea, or you know where they could dig into finding out for that prevalence study, because the more hard evidence we've got, the more governments of all persuasions will be to respond to that. Now, age discrimination is rife in our society, and and it continues to be a barrier for older people. But we have to remember that older people, like everyone else, have the right to work, be respected, and live lives dignity-free, and lives of dignity, and be free from violence and neglect and abuse. And I say to a lot of younger audiences, is whether it's a group of students at a medical graduation, which I've done, or a health science graduation, or a HR young people, human resources, that I can predict the future, and I won't be wrong. That if they don't die a premature death, they will grow old. Just absolutely sure as the sun comes up and the sun goes down at night. And the culture that they set will be the culture they inherit. So if they're prejudiced against older people and older people from the core community, that's what they'll experience. The young people coming up behind them will see that's the norm. And I say to them, if nothing else motivates you to address this issue, self-interest ought to. Thank you.